A Spitfire fought the Cold War with no guns. That's not a paradox, it's policy. The PRX-9 traded firepower for a service ceiling near 46,000 feet and over 1,080 miles of reach. Sweden's 50 aircraft purchase in 1948 wasn't nostalgia. It was surveillance. We'll connect a 1942 reconnaissance Spitfire that fell into Swedish hands, the brutal lessons of the hardest day, and why BR-601 survives to fly as a teaching tool. Keep watching to see how an icon's most strategic mission arrived after the shooting stopped. How does a fighter born in the Battle of Britain end up flying unarmed at 46,000 feet for a neutral country? Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. August 18, 1940 set the baseline. That day's concentrated attacks on fighter airfields exposed how thin reserves were and how quickly losses could outrun production. It forced an engineering response, not a slogan. The Spitfire needed more altitude performance, better climb, and enough resilience to hold the line when attrition bit hard. The path ran through the supercharger. Two-stage boost on the Merlin 61 opened the high-altitude envelope and produced the interim Mark 9 as a direct counter when pressure from newer opposition made the Mk5 ceiling and acceleration inadequate. By this point, the airframe had proven it could accept more power and cooling without starting over, which mattered when the requirement shifted from dogfights to reaching targets that sat far away and high. Here's the paradox handled head-on. The same platform that won turning fights was refit to carry film cans and fuel. Think of it as swapping a boxer's gloves for long-distance shoes. Same athlete, different event, because the strategic race now prizes who sees first. Guns added weight and drag and invited engagements. Cameras, tanks, and a pressure cabin demanded those same mass and drag budgets, so they took them. Design pivots followed logically. Armament came out. Fuel went in, fuselage and leading-edge tanks, so range extended. A pressurized cockpit reduced pilot fatigue and hypoxia risk at altitude. Camera bays with standardized mounts and heaters delivered consistent imagery across missions. It was therefore a reconnaissance machine by intent, not a defanged fighter by accident. Numbers anchor the shift. The PRX-9 entered RAF service in 1944. Service ceiling sat near 46,000 feet. Range exceeded 1,080 miles. That combination enabled discrete routing around defenses and short exposure times over denied areas. And it still drew its lineage from the Mk9, not a clean sheet aircraft, which kept maintenance processes familiar and performance credible. Contrast clarifies the continuity. The MKV struggled against newer threats. The Mk9 fixed the energy gap with the Merlin 61. The PRX-9 leveraged the same altitude gains for sensors rather than guns. One way or another, that's why a neutral state later saw value in a Spitfire that did not shoot. Britain had refused Sweden's 1939 request for fighters to keep the RAF supplied. Yet by the late 1940s, this lineage appealed precisely because it could watch quietly rather than fight loudly. We can now move on to the moment a reconnaissance Spitfire literally lands the concept in Sweden. Why did Sweden, denied fighters in 1939, commit to 50 unarmed Spitfires in 1948? As it happened, the seed was planted in wartime. On the 4th of August, 1942, a Spitfire PRIV with serial AB314 from number. One photographic reconnaissance unit crashed in Sweden after a reconnaissance sortie against German naval installations and warships in Norway. Swedish authorities handled the incident, and the pilot, Pultoff Whitaker, was repatriated on the 5th of April, 1943. The episode was a blunt lesson in the risks of reconnaissance and a live demonstration of a high-altitude camera aircraft's value. Neutrality never insulated Sweden from geography. It sat close to occupied Norway and Soviet power to the east, and it had to police its airspace while learning what passed just beyond it. So, the 1942 crash introduced more than a wreck. It showed speed that limited interception windows, altitude that pushed beyond routine fighter reach, and cameras that turned brief passes into actionable intelligence. By this point, senior officers could see the outline of a post-war requirement. The procurement logic in 1948 followed cleanly. Flag Vapnet acquired 50 Spitfire PRXIs, not as trophies but as a ready-made high-altitude camera fleet. Service ceiling near 46,000 feet. Maximum speed around 385 knots. Range beyond 1,080 miles. If you sum that up, you get a machine that could transit fast, climb high, and return with consistent imagery while staying outside most engagement envelopes of the day. Operations ran from 1948 to 1955, which matters because this was a pre-satellite window early in the jet era, with radar coverage still uneven over the Baltic approaches. Photographic coverage filled gaps you could not close with ground stations. It was therefore a strategic hedge and a daily tool. Mission profiles were designed around endurance and light. Long legs from Swedish bases, climbing to high transit altitudes to reduce interception probability, then timed passes to standardize shadow lengths on installations for easier measurement. The aircraft carried 3 cameras and no guns, which sounds like a vulnerability, but altitude, speed, and route planning substituted for self-defense. That trade was deliberate because the product was film, not air combat. One way or another, Sweden bought those 50 PRX-IXS to run reconnaissance across the Baltic region in the early Cold War, leveraging height and range rather than firepower. We can now move on to what those cameras looked at because targets define strategy. What did the Swedish PRXIs actually point their cameras at between 1948 and 1955? They built an order of battle map the slow way, by photographing what moved and what did not. Naval yards in the Baltic, air bases feeding forward detachments, and the rail and road nodes that told you how quickly a unit could shift. Infrastructure mapping came next. Piers, cranes, sheds, fuel farms, and the track plans around marshalling yards. Change detection tied it together, so repeated passes showed where concrete spread or dispersal hardstands multiplied. Denied area reconnaissance carried a diplomatic price tag. Every sortie asked the same question: is the image worth a protest note? So the planning worked backward from risk. Routes sat on international air and sea lanes as long as possible, with short doglegs to run camera lines, then a clean exit at altitude. The aircraft remained unarmed by design, which kept the mission profile narrow and the exposure short. Target sets were consistent and sterile. Baltic naval bases and shipyards, coastal radar chains and FLAC sites that guarded them, airfields hosting early Soviet jets and their dispersal strips, rail choke points feeding forward garrisons, especially junctions where single lines fanned out to ports, energy nodes, refineries, tank farms, and oil piers, because fuel revealed tempo and intent. Methods made the data usable. Crews flew repeated track lines for clean comparisons. Seasonal passes cut snow glare or leveraged low sun to throw long shadows that defined height. Standard focal length stayed constant so analysts could extract metric measurements without guesswork. It was therefore a production line. Minutes overhead, weeks on light tables. Performance narrowed the interception window. Ceiling near 46,000 feet and high cruise speed reduced the time early jets could climb into a firing solution, and the camera suite's resolution paid off when the window closed. By this point, a single run could seed multiple departments: naval analysts, airfield specialists, and logistics planners. By way of example, watch lists clustered around the approaches to Kaliningrad, installations along the Gulf of Finland littoral, and shipping lanes whose traffic patterns telegraphed mobilization. Risk management matched the stakes. Navigation margins kept the aircraft over international waters. Climb profiles kept the exposure short, and Swedish air defense sanitized return corridors. One way or another, the PRX-IX fleet built a photographic baseline of Baltic naval and air installations, radar sites, and key transport nodes without firing a shot. And when faster jets and better radar narrowed the window, The airframes left service while the story moved to preservation. How does a hard-fighting Mark IX like BR-601 end up teaching Cold War lessons decades later? BR-601 earned that right the hard way. It flew 116 combat missions with multiple RAF squadrons, rotating where the demand sat and absorbing the typical mix of bomber escorts, sweeps, and interceptions that defined mid-war fighter work. Post-war, it did not glide into a museum. It went to South Africa, served as an instructional airframe, lost parts to cannibalization, and then was scrapped before restoration brought it back as a flyer. Attrition logic would have left it in pieces. Preservation pulled the airframe into a second career. That tension matters. Wartime fleets are consumables, and you clear the line to make room for new metal. Historical fleets are sources, and you keep the survivors because they answer questions textbooks flatten. In any case, BR-601 bridges a design story that runs from Mk5 pressure through the Mk9's altitude gains to the PR-19's camera-first roll. It is one design tree with two branches, survival and combat on one side, survivability and reconnaissance on the other. Why a fighter to explain reconnaissance? Because the constraints are shared. The same aerodynamic cleanliness that helped a Mark IX hold energy also fed the PRX-IX's long legs. The same cooling margin needed for high boost at height underwrote stable cabin pressurization and camera heating. Think of the airframe as a chassis tuned for two events on the same track. Different kit, same underlying geometry. The technical bridge sits in the Merlin lineage. Two-stage supercharging, intercooling, and high-altitude mixture control are the common denominator. Those features kept fighters alive at 30,000 feet and let reconnaissance Spitfires operate where interception times were short. It was therefore credible to use a restored Mk9 as a narrator for the PRX-IX story. Museums and foundations lean on that credibility. Flights turn abstract surveillance economics into sound, speed, and measured climbs. BR-601's survival and return to flight makes the case that the unarmed PRX-IX mattered after 1945. One way or another, the family fought with guns, then with cameras, and now with memory.